Captain James Hartwell felt the whole world tighten around him the moment Hedgehog shuddered in the climb. The nose dipped an inch, just enough to tell an old pilot that something heavy was fighting back. A second later, the right wing vibrated under the weight of 16 guns and more than 11,000 rounds. Every gauge on the panel twitched like nervous eyes in a dark room. Then a thin line of smoke flashed past the left window. A German fighter diving out of the sun. The tail gunner shouted contact at the same time the ball turret snapped to life. For one frozen beat, the sky in front of Hedgehog was empty. Then two more fighters burst from cloud cover, closing fast at 12 high. The chin turret dropped and locked on target, its guns already spooling. Hartwell pushed the throttles forward and prayed the engines would hold. If you're new here, take a second to subscribe. It truly helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. And tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. If it is late, take care of yourself first. We are not 20 anymore. You can always come back to this story when you feel rested. The story brings us back to the afternoon of May 29th, 1943. At a place every bomber crewman remembers by smell alone. RAF Alconbury. Cold concrete. Warm engines. The taste of metal and dust that hangs in the air long before takeoff. Ground crews were finishing their last checks when Captain Hartwell climbed into the cockpit of his YB-40, a gunship so heavy it felt like a stubborn animal that needed coaxing more than flying. He had flown B-17s for years. He knew their habits, their moods, the way a standard fortress lifted off with an easy swing of the wings. Hedgehog was nothing like that. It weighed 4,000 extra pounds, even before the engines warmed. His flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison, moved through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood machines on a level most never reach. He checked each feed chute, each ammo can, each mounting bolt. 50 caliber rounds glinted like small brass promises in the morning light. 16 guns, more than any bomber in the sky that day. The crew talked less than usual, not because they were afraid, though every man carried his own version of fear. It was because they all knew Hedgehog was an experiment, a weapon built on hope as much as steel, and hope has a weight that no engineer can calculate. You could see it in the way the waist gunners checked their twin mounts again and again. You could hear it in the way Morrison tapped each gauge with a fingertip, as if asking the engines to be kind. At 1:25, the tower cleared the formation to start engines. 4 Wright Cyclones thundered awake under Hartwell's hands. The aircraft trembled like something trying to remember how to fly. He felt the drag immediately. More armor, more guns, more rounds than any flight handbook had ever predicted. The yoke carried that weight too, stiff in his grip. Still, the promise was intoxicating. Every approach vector covered, every blind spot erased. In theory, a gunship like this could turn the back of the formation into a wall of fire no German pilot would dare to cross. The lineup rolled onto the runway at 1:50. The day was bright and clear, the kind of English afternoon that made the sky look deceptively gentle. Hartwell eased the throttles forward. Hedgehog crawled at first, then pushed its weight against the runway with a grinding roar. The wheels lifted only when the bomber finally surrendered to physics. Morrison watched the climb rate with a tight jaw. He knew how a standard B-17 behaved on takeoff. He also knew this one carried a center of gravity that sat farther aft than any pilot liked to admit. The climb to cruising altitude usually took 25 minutes. Hedgehog needed nearly 50. By the time they formed up with the group, the flight engineer was already noting fuel burn that crept above the numbers in the briefing. Heavy aircraft burn, heavy fuel. There is no mystery in that. But the air over France never forgives a miscalculation. At 3:30, the formation reached the French coast. Flak blossomed in black flowers around the bomber stream. Radio calls crackled with warnings of fighters scrambling from fields near Rennes. It was the kind of radio traffic every 8th Air Force crew learned to read like a weather report. Because somewhere in all that static, you could hear your odds shrinking. Hedgehog held formation for the next half hour, its 16 guns rotating in smooth arcs as each gunner tracked shapes in the distance. The chin turret moved with uncanny grace, the new mechanism humming under the bombardier's boots. The crew believed in that turret. If anything could change the fate of a straggler, it was the pair of 50 caliber guns waiting under the nose. At 4:02, the target came into view. Saint Nazaire. The submarine pens that had swallowed so many Allied ships and demanded so many bomber crews pay with their lives. The main formation released their bombs in clean silver lines and began to climb. Not sharply, just enough. Enough for a heavy gunship like Hedgehog to feel the gap widen. Just enough for Hartwell to glance at his airspeed and know that the real test was beginning now. The climb after the bomb drop told Hartwell everything he needed to know, even before the numbers confirmed it. The lighter B-17s eased upward with that familiar confidence. Wings steady, engines happy. Hedgehog stayed flat, heavy, stubborn, like an old bulldog refusing to chase a faster dog. It was the moment every crewman realized the truth behind the experiment they were flying. The concept looked brilliant in a warm briefing room. It felt very different at 4 miles above France. But to understand why the Army Air Forces built this strange gunship in the first place, you have to step back from that afternoon sky and walk into the winter and spring of 1943. Back then, the 8th Air Force was bleeding out bombers faster than the factories could replace them. The numbers were whispered in ready rooms because no one wanted to say them loud. Half the crews never made it to 25 missions. Some groups lost an entire squadron's worth of B-17s in a single month. And the worst of it came from one angle. One brutal approach that German pilots had mastered to a science. 12 o'clock high. Head-on attacks were a nightmare. The nose guns on the early B-17F were never designed to track a fighter screaming straight at them at nearly 400 miles an hour. Cheek guns were placed too wide, leaving a blind gap right in the center. German pilots saw that hole, again and again, and they flew straight through it with cannon fire that split bomber formations open. If you ever meet an old B-17 man, ask him what a frontal attack felt like. He will probably pause, look away for a second, and you will understand without hearing a word. Long-range escorts were the dream everyone prayed for. But in early 43, those fighters simply did not exist. P-47s were tough, but short-legged. Spitfires were fast but thirsty. P-38s had the reach, but mechanical issues kept them unreliable in the cold European air. So the idea came from a simple, almost childlike question. If fighters can't escort bombers all the way to Germany and back, then why not turn a bomber into a fighter? Engineers stripped a B-17F down to nothing that didn't shoot. Bomb racks gone. Bombardier's nose replaced by a twin 50 caliber chin turret no one had seen before. A second dorsal turret added behind the radio room. Waist guns doubled. Mounts reinforced. Ammunition tripled to more than 11,000 rounds. Armor plates bolted in every direction a fighter could approach from. It was a fortress built on top of another fortress, a floating pillbox with propellers. On paper, it was spectacular. Every angle covered, every field of fire overlapping. Any German fighter that tried a head-on pass would be met with a storm of lead before it even reached its firing line. The crews at Alconbury called it the Flying Destroyer, half with pride, half with the nervous laugh of men who could already feel the weight pressing into their shoulders, because every improvement, every new gun, every extra belt of ammo had a cost that no one could hide. Physics does not care about optimism. More guns mean more weight. More weight means more drag. And drag has a cruel sense of timing in combat. Hartwell understood that better than most. He had flown 42 missions before the YB-40 program, enough to know how a fortress behaved when it was stressed. But this new gunship didn't behave stressed. It behaved overloaded. The engines ran hot even in level flight. The climb margins narrowed to nothing. The formation speeds that B-17 crews took for granted crept beyond reach. Hope turned into a calculation, and the calculation never added up in their favor. Yet none of that mattered to the men writing the strategy. They believed the firepower would outweigh the flaws, that a handful of these gunships could anchor the back of a bombing formation and protect dozens of lighter aircraft. They believed the YB-40 would change the air war over Europe. And on that first mission, for a few minutes, it almost looked like they were right. Because moments after the bomb drop, as Hedgehog began to lag behind, the first German fighters appeared. And what happened next would prove one thing beyond any doubt. The firepower worked. It worked so well the Germans backed off. But the price of that firepower was about to show itself in the most brutal way possible. And in the next moments, as the formation pulled farther ahead and the sky over France turned quiet, Hartwell saw something no engineer in America had predicted. A gunship built to protect bombers was about to become the easiest prey on the entire battlefield. The moment the main formation began its gentle climb, the gap opened like a slow wound spreading across the sky. It started small, the kind of distance a pilot notices only because he knows the rhythm of his own aircraft. The lighter B-17s rose 100 feet, then 2, sliding ahead with the confidence of machines no longer burdened by explosives. Hedgehog stayed low, engines straining, the climb rate dying in Hartwell's hands. He pushed the throttles to maximum continuous power. The bomber responded with a groan, the kind you feel through the seat before you hear it in the metal. 3 miles, 4 miles. It happened quietly, almost politely, the way a door shuts on you before you realize you're outside. The gunship meant to guard the formation was now a shape in the far distance, a lone aircraft dragging its weight through cold air. Morrison saw it too. He climbed down from the top turret, knelt beside the engine controls, and studied each gauge with the grim calm of a man who has watched engines fail before. Number 3 cylinder head temperature was climbing higher than any cyclone liked to admit. He eased the power back, just enough to keep the engine alive. But even that small mercy came at a cost. Hedgehog slowed again. 148 miles an hour. Then 142. The formation ahead grew smaller, a gray thread fading into afternoon haze. From the waist, Frank Delaney's voice cut through the intercom. Contrails. 4 o'clock high. 6 aircraft. Maybe 8. Sliding down the back of the formation like wolves finding the slowest deer. The crew knew the pattern by heart. German fighters rarely wasted time on the center of a bomber stream. They hunted the stragglers. They hunted exactly what Hedgehog had become. The first FW-190 dove from above and behind. The position tail gunners hated most. Raymond Koch opened fire at 800 yards, his tracer line walking toward the fighter's nose. The German pilot broke left early, unwilling to test his luck against a gunship with a bite this big. A second attacker came in from 11 high. 2 fighters stacked, timing their dive. The chin turret dropped, tracked, and fired a long, steady burst. 50 caliber rounds stitched the FW-190's cowling. Black smoke poured from the nose before the aircraft rolled inverted and vanished toward the channel. The second pilot broke off without firing a shot. For 6 minutes, Hedgehog became everything the designers dreamed it could be. Firepower answered every angle. Attackers refused to close. The sky around the bomber glowed with overlapping arcs of tracer fire, a moving fortress of brass and flame. But firepower can only solve the problems that enter its range. It can't pull you back to safety. It can't give you speed. And speed was the one thing no one could rebuild in the air. 7 miles now, then 8. The formation ahead blurred into a line too thin to measure. Hartwell saw it and felt the cold truth settle in his chest. You can't defend a formation you can't reach. You can't protect anyone if you are the one everyone else must protect. The German fighters circled at a distance, studying the gunship, figuring out what most pilots eventually learn. A heavy bomber that can't run becomes predictable, and predictable targets die. Then a voice crackled on the radio. Another YB-40. Captain Richard Hayes. His gunship had fallen behind too. Identical problem. Identical story. He suggested they pair up. 32 guns were better than 16. No one argued. Hayes descended to match Hartwell's altitude. The 2 heavy gunships flew side by side. A loose formation of 2 limping fortresses with too much firepower and not enough speed to save themselves. The Luftwaffe formation widened. 4 fighters, maybe 6, pacing them like hunters, waiting for the wounded animal to falter. They weren't attacking. They weren't leaving either. They were choosing the perfect moment. At 5:07, Hartwell crossed the French coast outbound. Water stretched below, cold and gray. The kind of channel you pray never becomes your landing strip. Number 3, engine kept flirting with the red. Hayes reported oil pressure dropping on his number 2 engine. Within minutes, he throttled it back to avoid seizure. His gunship slowed to 138. Both aircraft were struggling now. Fuel ticking down faster than the math allowed. Altitude slipping. Hope thinning. Then 2 Mi-29s appeared behind them, diving through 18,000 feet. Koch fired first, his tracers cutting the air in desperate arcs. The Germans closed to 400 yards and fired 20-millimeter rounds that tore through Hedgehog's tail, punching metal aside like paper. One shell burst in the horizontal stabilizer. Another ripped through the fuselage 2 feet behind CAC. Control surfaces shook. Trim jammed. Hartwell fought the yoke with both hands, every muscle burning. The gunship was still flying, only because he refused to let it fall. And just when the sky felt empty except for enemies, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts dropped in from the northeast like steel angels answering a prayer. The German fighters broke away. The Thunderbolts formed up, wings rocking, guiding the 2 heavy gunships toward England. It should have been the moment everyone breathed again. But Hartwell wasn't sure they would make the coast. And even if they did, the worst truth of the YB-40 concept was becoming impossible to ignore. Because the engines were hot, the fuel was low, and the fix everyone hoped for was nowhere in that sky. And in the next chapter of this story, the real consequences of those few miles of separation will come due in a way the Army Air Forces could no longer deny. Hedgehog made the English coast by the grace of thin fuel lines and stubborn men. But the landing was only the beginning of the real storm, because the moment Hartwell shut down the engines at Alconbury, the cold truth of the YB-40 followed him down the ladder like a shadow that refused to let go. Colonel William Reed was waiting on the hardstand. He did not shout. He did not need to. The look on Hartwell's face told him more than any report. 90 minutes of fighting the yoke had drained every ounce of strength out of the captain. His flight suit hung heavy with sweat, his hands still trembling. When Reed asked for his assessment, Hartwell gave him 3 words that carried the weight of the whole sky. It can't keep up. Those words would echo through every briefing room for the next 2 months. Because the 8th Air Force needed the YB-40 to succeed. They needed a miracle. And miracles are hard to let go of, especially in a war that eats hope for breakfast. So they sent the gunships out again. June 15th, target Le Mans. 4 YB-40s launched. 4 fell behind, without fail. The formation dropped its bombs, climbed, accelerated, and the YB-40s dropped out the back like anchors in the wind. The Germans barely had to change tactics. They simply waited for the gunships to lag. Then they attacked from distance, dipping in and out of range, probing for weak angles. And there were always weak angles when you were alone. 1 week later came the mission to the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant. 11 YB-40s dispatched. 1 lost to flak and fighters. 10 limped home hours after the rest of the group had already landed, refueled, and headed to debrief. It became a pattern no one could spin into something positive. Every sortie ended the same way. Gunships scattered across the sky, each one carrying too much weight and too little speed to stay alive without luck. Engineers tried to fix it. They moved ammunition forward. They changed feed systems. They shaved a few pounds where they could. Every small tweak helped a little, but solved nothing. Physics was the enemy, and physics was undefeated. A standard B-17F weighed 65,000 pounds on takeoff and 48,000 after dropping bombs. A YB-40 weighed 68,000 on takeoff and 64,000 after combat. That difference might look small on paper. In the air, it was fatal. The 8th Air Force compiled the data, and numbers told the story with a cold honesty no pilot could soften. 48 sorties, 5 confirmed German fighters destroyed, 2 probable, One gunship lost, and every single YB-40 fell behind its formation after bomb drop. Average separation 7 miles. Average time alone 38 minutes. In European daylight bombing, 38 minutes alone might as well be a lifetime. Even the Luftwaffe noticed. Adolf Galland read the intelligence reports and offered his verdict with a sharpness only a fighter ace could deliver. The kills, he said, were insignificant, not worth the cost. The gunships were not threats. They were invitations. They drew fire. They slowed the stream. They made the whole formation easier to attack. His pilots preferred to hunt YB-40s rather than avoid them, and that was the final nail. A weapon designed to protect bombers had become the favorite target of the enemy. No commander could defend that equation. On July 29th, the last 2 YB-40s flew their final mission. Both fell behind. Both required fighter escort just to reach England. Neither returned to its home base. The program died that day, even before the paperwork caught up. By August, the cancellation was official. 12 gunships, 3 months, millions of dollars, thousands of rounds fired, and not a single mission where the concept had actually worked. But buried in the wreckage of the program was something no one expected. Something small, something brilliant, something that would rewrite the future of the B-17. And in the next chapter, you will see how one forgotten detail from this failed gunship became the single most important upgrade in the entire Flying Fortress line. When the YB-40 program finally collapsed under the weight of its own promise, most men at Alconbury assumed the entire project would vanish into a filing cabinet. No one opened again. That is how failed weapons usually die. Quietly, without ceremony, without credit. But that didn't happen here, because a handful of engineers at Wright Field refused to let the story end, where the gunship stopped flying. They read every combat report from those 3 brutal months. Not just the losses, not just the fuel numbers. They studied the angles of attack, the ammunition expenditure, the times of day, the tactical behavior of German pilots. They were looking for patterns, and they found one. Every time a YB-40 faced a frontal attack, the gunship survived. Not because of luck, not because of tight formation flying. It survived because of a strange new piece of hardware that looked almost out of place on a B-17F. The Bendix chin turret. It sat under the nose like a steel jaw, low, purposeful, and unmistakably dangerous. 250 caliber Brownings, electrically driven, remotely controlled from the bombardier's position, with a clear field of fire straight ahead. No bomber in the world had anything like it before that turret. German pilots owned the 12 o'clock angle. Everyone knew it. They dove straight at bomber formations with confidence, firing cannons into that narrow gap between the cheek guns. Some veterans still swear nothing in the air felt as hopeless as watching a FW-190 closing head-on at 400 miles an hour, its wings twitching. The muzzle flashes blooming before you could even swing a gun around. But the YB-40 changed that. Even in its failure, it delivered something the enemy did not expect, a nose that could bite back, on the mission where Hedgehog fell behind. That chin turret had already proven its worth. 1 fighter down, 2 attacks broken off, and a clear shift in the behavior of every German pilot who tried to use the frontal approach. They saw the tracers early. They felt the accuracy. They backed away. So the engineers took everything the YB-40 did wrong and pushed it aside. Weight, drag, ammunition overload. They threw all of that out. And they took the one thing the gunship did perfectly and pushed it into full production. By September 1943, the Bendix Model A chin turret became standard on the last blocks of B-17F. A month later, Boeing rolled it directly into the design of the new model, the B-17G. And that is where the numbers flipped from tragedy to math that felt almost miraculous. Look at the early combat reports from groups flying the G model. 91st Bomb Group, 12 frontal attacks on a mission to Gelsenkirchen. 10 broke off before firing. The other 2 pressed in, and both took heavy hits. Not a single bomber lost to the angle that used to kill entire crews in under 3 seconds. The 379th saw their frontal losses drop from 11% to 4%. The 384th tracked their data down to the minute. Before the chin turret, they lost 43 bombers to frontal attacks over 6 months. After it, 14 bombers over an entire year. Across all groups, all missions, all theaters in Europe, the 8th Air Force statisticians delivered the verdict in one simple number. Frontal attack losses dropped by 71%. And if you talk to the old air crews, the ones who flew those G models into Germany in '44, many will tell you that number feels low. Because the truth is this: a chin turret didn't just give the bomber a new angle of defense. It changed the way German pilots fought. Some refused to make head-on passes at all. Others approached cautiously and lost the speed advantage that made those attacks deadly. Some groups flew entire missions without seeing a single frontal run. And none of that would have happened without a gunship that could not keep up, without a failed escort concept, without 12 aircraft that were never meant to rewrite history, but did anyway. Factories in Seattle, Wichita, Tulsa, Long Beach, and Burbank ramped up production. 50 B-17Gs a month at the start of '44, then 120, then 230 a month by midsummer. By the time the war ended, 8,680 G models had been built. Every single one carried the chin turret, born from the ashes of the YB-40. Every bomber crew that survived a frontal attack owed a silent debt to a gunship most people never heard about. Every pilot who made it to 25 missions because a FW-190 broke off early was touched by the work of a program that officially failed. Every life saved traced back to a turret that emerged from 3 months of desperation, courage, and brutal learning. And the surprise is this: the chin turret was only the first gift the YB-40 left behind. There were 2 more changes, smaller on paper, but just as life-saving in the chaos of combat. And in the next chapter, you will see how a crowded waist compartment and a blind tail window turned into 2 upgrades that shaped every B-17G that ever flew into enemy fire. So, the chin turret was the headline, the star, the part everyone remembers when they talk about the B-17G. But buried in the YB-40's short, painful life were 2 quieter innovations. The kind you only appreciate when you've stood in a bomber's fuselage with guns firing inches from your ribs. They didn't grab attention. They didn't make the newspapers. But ask any waist gunner or any tail gunner who lived through '44, and you'll hear the same answer. These 2 changes mattered. The first lived in the waist section, the tightest, loudest hallway in the entire airplane. On the early B-17F, the right and left waist gunners stood directly across from each other. 2 men, 2 heavy guns, and barely enough room to swing your elbows without smacking the other guy in the face. In combat, it turned chaotic. When both men tried to track fighters at the same time, they collided, bumped, tangled ammo belts, blocked each other's sight lines. Some units filmed their own engagements just to prove how bad it was. Shots ruined, windows crowded, field of fire cut in half because 2 men were fighting physics instead of the enemy. The YB-40 team saw that problem on day 1. So they moved the right waist position forward by 30 inches. Just 30 inches. A shift no bigger than the width of a kitchen drawer. But in the air, that small adjustment changed everything. The 2 gunners stopped bumping each other. They stopped blocking each other's arcs. They could track a fighter from beam to astern without stumbling over boots or belts. Engagement time nearly doubled. Accuracy jumped. Confidence rose. And the solution was so simple, you wonder how no one thought of it earlier. Boeing studied the footage. They studied the YB-40's reports. And when the B-17G rolled out, the staggered waist gun positions became standard. Every waist gunner after that had room to breathe, room to move, room to fight. The second upgrade came from the very back of the aircraft, in a place only 1 man ever saw during combat. The tail. Sergeant Cack and other tail gunners reported the same problem again and again. Small windows, narrow sight lines, a limited view of fighters sliding low under the 6 o'clock position. When you're the last set of eyes in the formation, losing sight of a fighter for even a second can cost the entire crew. So the Cheyenne Modification Center redesigned the whole tail assembly. Bigger windows, curved frames, better elevation angles, improved gun mounts, more armor where it counted. It wasn't just a better view, it was a better chance of survival. Together, the staggered waist and the Cheyenne tail turned the G model into something the F model never could be. Not just better armed, better manned, better suited for the chaos the war kept throwing at it. And in the next chapter, the story returns to 1 man, standing on a cold English hardstand, watching the first B-17Gs arrive, and realizing the strange truth no one expected. The YB-40 had failed, but it had changed everything. When the last YB-40 left England and the program faded into silence, most men assumed the gunship would disappear from history altogether. But months later, in the winter light of 1943, Captain James Hartwell stood on a cold hardstand at Alconbury and watched the first B-17Gs taxi in. Fresh paint, new turrets, staggered waist, Cheyenne tail, all the pieces that had been tested in fear, in sweat, in lonely miles over France. You can picture him there, a man who had fought a bomber that refused to climb, now watching younger crews crowd around the chin turret, tapping its metal, asking where it came from. He didn't brag. Men like him rarely did. He simply told the truth. The turret came from a gunship that couldn't keep up, a machine that failed its mission but left behind ideas that saved thousands. And that is the part of this story that lingers long after the statistics fade. Because failure in war is usually fatal. But every now and then, a failure becomes a teacher. A harsh teacher Yes, but a necessary one. The YB-40 didn't escort anyone home. It didn't change the tide of a single bombing mission. But it gave the B-17G its teeth. It gave waist gunners room to fight. It gave tail gunners a chance to survive. It gave thousands of men one more sunrise they never would have seen. If you walk through the museum in Dayton today and stand in front of the B-17G displayed there, you'll see the chin turret gleaming under the lights. You'll read the plaque. You'll notice it never mentions the YB-40. History remembers the victor, the hero, the machine that finished the job. It forgets the path of broken ideas that made that victory possible. But anyone who has worn a flight jacket in an English winter knows the truth. Success is built on the shoulders of the things that didn't work. And maybe that's the real lesson tucked inside the steel ribs of that forgotten gunship. That even the ideas that fail can push the next idea forward. That sometimes progress comes disguised as a mistake. And that men like Hartwell, and the crews who flew those 12 impossible aircraft, carried the weight so others could fly lighter. Let me ask you something. Friend, if you had been in a YB-40 over France, knowing you would fall behind, would you still believe the price was worth it for the crews who came after you? And have you ever stood beside a B-17G in a museum, looked at that chin turret, and wondered how many forgotten failures are hiding inside its metal? If this story moved you even a little, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to keep these memories alive. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. We're not young anymore, so take care of yourself first. Listen at your own pace, and know this every time you come back. You help make sure these crews are never forgotten.